What's ridiculous is President Trump tried to take credit for the economy around the time he was elected, that the economy was improving because people are anticipating him. And now he's saying that now that he's actually been president, that it's Biden. Like, we all know what's going on in this data. There's just been a lot of people are just not sure what President Trump's going to do. So let's put aside whether tariffs are a good idea or a bad idea. Nobody actually even really knows what's going to happen. And that is meant that, there's just been a huge run up in inventories, because if you're not sure what's going to happen, one way to get around that is to just make your purchases now, stock up inventories, and then at least you can give yourself some certainty about what your business will look like for the next 3 or 4 months. And so we saw a lot of businesses really go down that path in this quarter, which actually makes this data particularly hard to interpret in terms of where we'll be next quarter. But one thing we can know for sure is this is President Trump's economy.
Well, you probably heard us discussing, Betsy, and maybe you heard Peter Navarro or President Trump talking about the benefits of an import surge. Peter Navarro called it extraordinary and said this was the best negative print for GDP I've ever seen. What will be the fallout of that extraordinary import surge later in the year?
I don't actually know what they mean by that. It seems kind of ironic to me, because I thought the whole idea was to get us to reduce our imports. And there's so much anxiety that we might have to reduce imports that it caused us all to increase our imports. So it will be pretty funny if at the end of 2025, it turns out we've imported more things under President Trump's first year than we had under President Biden's last year. But aside from that, I think there's a lot of confusion when people look at the GDP numbers, because they say, well, the problem is negative because of, we subtract the imports. But remember, we're also adding the imports. So the reason we're subtracting them is we add up all the money that companies spend, and that includes the money they're spending on imports. But because we're not making those in the United States, this is a fair complaint that I think President Trump would agree with. We don't want to count those as part of our economy, because we only want to count the stuff that we're making, we're producing, our goods and services. So we subtract from their spending what they spent on imports. Now, if you want to get a little wonky, it's quite possible that there are some measurement issues, which means we're better at counting the imports that we're subtracting off than counting up all the purchases. And so when we get a revision, it might not be quite as negative, because we might be adding more in on the purchases side than we're subtracting off on the import side. But I think some of this is also what companies are doing is they're prioritizing their spending on imports, which means not spending on stuff we're producing domestically. So there is a trade-off. Every dollar you spend on something is a dollar you're not spending on something else. And if you're terrified that imports aren't going to be available to you, so you're spending all your money on that, what aren't you buying?
Well, yeah. Would that include, say, adding salaries, hiring people, Betsy? How quickly could this bleed into the labor market as we look ahead to a jobs report on Friday?
Absolutely, right? If you're out there buying equipment because you're thinking, if I don't get ahead on this equipment, that's going to be a priority to you over, say, replacing a worker who's left, or making sure you keep a worker by giving them a raise. So you can absolutely think that this has a direct impact on the domestic workforce. Look, the thing we don't know is we don't know what's going to happen with tariffs. So we don't know what these businesses are going to do in the second quarter. Are they going to keep trying? It's sort of, I think we're done trying to accumulate imports, internationally now, right? So now we got to live off our inventories. How quickly do we spend them down? When do they get to go back to importing things at an affordable price? And that'll affect what ends up happening to workers and whether they need to let people go. I think a lot of companies struggled to hire coming out of the pandemic. So we're going to see companies being quite slow to let people go, but they will also be slow to fill empty slots. So that's the path we're currently on. And the question will be whether they get desperate enough that they have to let people go. I'm going to tell you that the warning that President Trump is giving us that we're going to have fewer stuff on our shelves, that's not a good one.